Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Orla and I'm delighted to be joined by Lisa Hoving from Intercept in the Netherlands, who'll be talking to you today about Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks or Azure Synapse Analytics, when to use what. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC22. Don't forget to check out the Resource Centre. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. Continue your Azure learning by joining us again tomorrow for 2 webinars, Azure Monitor for the Enterprise with Michael Johnson from Microsoft, and Getting Started in DevOps with Damien Flynn from InnoFactor in Ireland. Find out more at sharepointeurope.com/Azure-Week. Deep dive into topics of your choice with the ESPC22 tutorials. Experience a full-day expert-led workshop on the SharePoint framework, search, security, AI, hybrid work, Azure Arc, Microsoft 365 or Microsoft Viva. Find out more at sharepointeurope.com/ESPC22-tutorials. Our ESPC22 early bird sale is now on. Save €200 on 3- and 4-day tickets. Find out more at sharepointeurope.com. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you'll be notified by email when it's available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our presenter, Lisa. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Thank you.
Okay, I think I can start showing my screen. 1 second. I will start the slideshow.
You can see your screen now, Lisa. Thanks.
Yes. Can everybody see my screen okay? Yes? Right. Thank you. So today is going to be an extremely hot day in the Netherlands. So I think it's good that we take it easy. You know, not to go too fast. This talk is going to be about 45 minutes, I would say. So there is plenty of time to ask questions if you have any. Orla and I already talked this over, but if you want to, yeah, let's really take it easy today. Good. All right, so we already talked it over. If you want to have questions regarding the talk, just feel free to put them in the chat immediately and Orla can just unmute yourself and ask me the questions. Then we can talk about it, which would be great, of course, because interaction is always nice. If you have any questions regarding your specific data wishes or your use case, I would say maybe wait until the end of the talk so that people find this interesting, they can stay and we can chat about it. Or if you have more specific questions regarding your own use case, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn. My handle will be there in a few. So today we're going to talk about Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks or Synapse Analytics and when to use what. My name is Lisa Hoving. I work as an Azure data engineer at Intercept. In my daily work, I help to guide customers to the cloud and within the cloud and create great data solutions. So for my work at Intercept, I have plenty of experience using Azure Databricks, Azure Synapse Analytics, and Azure Data Factory, of course. Again, if you want to reach out to me, that would be great. You can do that via LinkedIn if you want to. I do have Twitter, but I don't use it too often, so I'm sorry about that, but LinkedIn would be a great way for me. So what are we going to talk about today? The idea behind this talk was to give people an insight on, how to make a decision between these free tools that you often see within Azure and sometimes it's really difficult if you start working with Azure to know what tool is right for you from the get-go. So in the end, the idea is that you have a thorough understanding on how to choose between these tools. But of course, that topic is going to be a little bit boring, so to speak. So we're going to make a decision following a use case. This is going to be the use case of Henk. And between all of the steps within this talk, there's going to be a point where we say, okay, well, what tool do we think at this point is going to be best for our use case, is going to be best for Henk? And the questions asked, I'm going to use via Mentimeter, and I will explain more about that in a bit. So that's going to be very fun, but sometimes Mentimeter works a little bit iffy, so I might have to go out of the presentation and refresh, but we'll see when that happens. So what we're going to talk about first today is about Henk. Who is Henk and what use case does he have? Well, of course, if you want to make a decision for Henk, what tool is best for him, so that being Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks, or Synapse Analytics, it would be great that we knew from the beginning, you know, what these tools are. So we're going to have a brief introduction on these tools. Then we're going to compare these tools, first of all, of course, based on functionality, but also based on costs and based on performance. But in the end, we're going to arrive to our conclusion in a little bit a different way. So we're going to choose more subjectively, and we're going to talk about that as well. All right, but that's enough about me. I would like to know about you. So do you already have experience using one of these tools, or do you not have any experience with these tools at all, and are you just starting out? Let me check on the website and see if Mentimeter works correctly. And then I will. It could be that there is some latency, so I don't know if the questions will come in, but we can always go back to them, of course, so that's not an issue. Yes. So I'm going to fill in the questions as well, just to make sure that everything works. And I, of course, have some experience using Azure Data Factory and Azure Databricks and Synapse Analytics, else it would be a bit silly to start this talk if I didn't have experience. All right. So some have experience using Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse Analytics, which is, of course, great. Most people don't have any experience, so that's totally fine, right? So this talk is especially for people that are at the beginning of their data journey and that need to make a decision. For me, I would say I have most experience using Azure Databricks. That's going to be, you know, my preferred tool of choice. It's also good to keep that in mind during this talk, because of course, if we're going to make a decision more subjectively, then it's good to know that, you know, I really like Azure Databricks. So. And I would say it's also important, if you want to join a conversation, if I say anything that feels kind of subjective and you have a different experience, then also feel free to put that in the chat. And then we can have a talk about it. Because yeah, sometimes making a decision between these tools, that can be quite subjective. All right, so I have quite a few answers here, so that's really good. I think for now we can continue. I would say the majority doesn't have any experience with these tools, which is of course fine. We're going to talk about the tools in details later on, but let's move on with Henk first. So Henk is going to make a journey to the cloud. Who is Henk? Henk is a BI specialist. He has worked at a large insurance company for over 20 years already. So Henk is really, you know, a senior BI specialist. Regarding his skills, he can make all of your graphs look super fancy. You know, that's what these BI specialists do, right? And he has some experience using Azure SQL Server, but mainly he has been working with Power BI. Well, he can do SQL and he has dabbled a little bit in Python as well. So, you know, he might have some experience using that. If we talk about Henk as a person, you know, he's Dutch, just like me. So we never want to pay a penny too much, especially when it comes to our infrastructure, right? Oh. And maybe more importantly, Henk, like me, likes cats. So. But Henk has gotten a use case from his manager. So his manager said, hey, we have sales data on all the sales that were closed. So I have a snippet of this data in the right-hand corner. And here you can see, for example, at the 5th of May, Amber has sold a mortgage product for a total of about 147 1,000 euros. I would say it's euros. And that product, of course, has a product ID and a sales ID to go with it. And Hank's manager has asked him to aggregate the sales data on salesperson per month so that we can see what salespeople outperform from month to month, so that maybe they can get a bonus or anything like that, but at least they can have a little bit of a gut feeling on what is happening in the sales department. So Hank has sales data on, which is about 6 million records over 3 years. That's quite a lot of data. So salespeople have been on it for quite some time, I would say, 6 million sales. And this data is stored in a Parquet format. For the people that are not acquainted with Parquet, it's quite, a format that is often used in big data, and it's just a format just like CSV, for example. But then with Parquet, we have our schema, stored with it. So that makes it quite nice. So it's stored in that Parquet format. All right, so let's take a step back. What do we know? So we know that Hank has sales data and he needs to aggregate it on salesperson per month. Well, we're going to store this Parquet data in a storage account, which is quite, regular thing you would do on Azure. And we need to aggregate this data using, a tool. And in the end, that's going to land in Power BI. So that's going to be our use case today. What data tool are we going to use to aggregate this data on salesperson per month? Okay, so right off the bat, what do you think Hank should choose? Because he's kind of questioning his Azure life decisions here. And I will see if it refreshes so that people can, yeah, not yet. So I will refresh it manually. Just 1 second. Yeah, now it should be okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned, I have experience using Azure Databricks. I really liked it, so I'm just going to fill that in. But maybe these other tools could be a good decision as well, right? So Azure Data Factory using the GUI could be nice. So let's start with that Azure Data Factory, shall we? And the question should remain open, so if you want to answer it, we can always go back to it. But let's dig a little bit further into these tools, starting with Azure Data Factory. So what is Azure Data Factory? Azure Data Factory is a tool that is specifically geared towards data ingestion and data transformation. So that means getting data from point A to point B and then transforming it. Like, for example, that use case with Hank with regard to aggregation, that could be a transformation. In Azure Data Factory, we work using a graphical user interface. So we don't code. That's good to kind of get a grasp on that. So it's basically, it's a bit, a drag and drop tool, so to speak, using that graphical user interface. Well, we have a choice here. So we can work in pipelines where we drag activities to a canvas. That could, for example, be a copy activity to move data from, let's say, a storage account to SQL Server. We can use data flows. And in these data flows, we can also ingest data, but also do more like transformations. And these data flows use Spark under the hood. Meanwhile, these pipelines, they use another processing power. It's an integration runtime. Then lastly, if we want to transform data in more of a user interface that we are acquainted with using Power BI, then we can use Power Query, because Power Query kind of looks a little bit like Power BI, so it's very handy for users that know that tool already. Well, as I mentioned, these pipelines, they run on the integration runtime. Meanwhile, the data flows, they run on Spark. So these are two different things that they do under the hood to process data. Azure Data Factory has over 90 already built-in data sources, or at least this was the thing that they kind of marketed with. So it would be my best guess that at this point they have many more than 90 built-in data sources. But that means that out of the box you can connect to many different data sources and ingest them and transform them to your liking. So that's very great, and that's a lot of data sources. So the chance that your data source is included, that's going to be very large. So this is an example of a canvas in Azure Data Factory. So what you can see here to the left is that I created a pipeline called aggregate sales, which is of course the use case of Hank. And then you can also see to the left that we have data flows where you can also ingest and transform data and Power Query. So I created some data flows, but not yet any Power Query. And then you can see that I have the salesperson aggregate data flow open, and I have some activities here. So I'm ingesting the sales data, I'm doing some transformations. In the end, I'm sorting the data on year, month, and salesperson, and then I'm going to sync and write it back to storage. So this is what Azure Data Factory would look like. And that's all good and all, you know, because I would say if you read the documentation, then very often you get a grasp on what a tool can do, but not really about what a tool can't do. So I do want to, you know, take some time and talk about the downsides to Azure Data Factory and Azure Databricks and Synapse Analytics. So one of the downsides to Azure Data Factory is those over 90 integrated data sources. So it's very easy if your data source is included. But if it is not, then you have to custom code these connectors and use them in Azure Data Factory, which is, I would say, incredibly cumbersome and a lot more complicated than just programming and doing it yourself. So if your data source is not included, then with Azure Data Factory, you're most likely going to have a bad time. So it's good if you start using Azure Data Factory to check beforehand whether all of your data sources are natively included in Azure Data Factory. Well, if we think about the graphical user interface, you know, it has benefit because if you don't know how to code, then you can drag and drop these activities, but it also has some downside. So it has little flexibility beyond what's already available, right? So you're kind of limited to all these activities that you can drop to the canvas. So if you want to do anything that's not readily available in Azure Data Factory, that's going to be incredibly difficult, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get it done. In addition to this, it's also difficult to create generic pipelines. So sometimes with data, we have a use case where we ingest many different tables from the same source. Well, it's going to be difficult to make this generic in Azure Data Factory because we have to click and type in everything by hand. Meanwhile, if we were to use code, then we can make more of a, you know, generic function, and we just put that function in many times. And with Azure Data Factory, this is not really as easy. And again, due to this graphical user interface, all of the computations, they are under the hood. So it's extremely difficult to optimize this if some of the computations are not as efficient as you want them to be. So that's good to take into account. All right, so that's Azure Data Factory, but let's move on to Azure Databricks. What is it? Oh. Azure Databricks is quite a comprehensive data analytics platform. And with comprehensive, I mean that it can do more than what you could do with Azure Data Factory. So what you can do with Databricks is ingestion and transformation, much like we saw with Azure Data Factory, but we can also do data analysis and data visualization. We can solve data science use cases, machine learning use cases. Well, what's cool about Databricks is that nowadays it has native Power BI integration. So if you want to work with Power BI, that's good. You can just connect to it using these endpoints, and then you're all set, basically. Well, you can solve use cases for multiple disciplines, as I mentioned. Data scientists can do their work, but data engineers and data analysts and even BI specialists can do their work in Databricks as well, which is very cool. Usually in Databricks, you work using notebooks. For the people that are acquainted with Jupyter notebooks, well, it looks very similar to that, and I will show you in a minute. What we can do in Databricks is our computational power comes from Spark. So that's a little bit different than Azure Data Factory, where we had this integration runtime and Spark. Here it's only Spark, but we can set up this Spark cluster within minutes, and we can auto-scale it as well if we like. So that means that our data processes are extremely scalable. So we'll automatically scale to the workload that we have. Databricks always ensures, and I think they do this very well, that we can run the latest version of Apache Spark. So if you want to be on top of what is coming out, what's new, and you want to utilize all these new functions, then Databricks is going to be the tool for you. And that's very nice. If we want to program Python, Scala, R, Java, and even SQL, then Databricks is going to be a good platform for us. And we're going to see a little bit later on that with Synapse, of course, we can also program Spark, but the languages are a little bit different, so pay attention to that. But here we can use Python, Scala, R, Java, and SQL. So what would that look like? Here I have an Azure Databricks notebook where I implemented the use case of Hank. Well, what we can see in the top left corner is that I created a cluster. Well, as happens, sometimes you create multiple clusters to try things out. So it's called Azure Live 2. And then the notebook is also called Azure Live 2. As you can see with the gray dot here, the cluster is not currently running. So I have run things beforehand. You can still see some of the results, but at this point, the cluster is set off. Well, what we can see in the cells, so the CMD2, CMD1, what you can see here, these are called cells, and there I can put in my code. So what I did here was I read in my Parquet files and I created some additional columns. Then I grouped by all the data by month, years, and salesperson because that was our use case. We wanted to aggregate this data on month, year, and salesperson. And then I renamed some of the columns. I ordered the data so that it was in a nice format and I wrote it back to the system. All right. So what you saw here basically is one of the views that Azure Databricks has. So this was the data science and data engineering sidebar, they call it. But there are different sidebars as well. So if you are a data analyst or a BI specialist and you want to utilize different functions, like for example, these visualizations and code mainly using SQL, then we have a different kind of view in Databricks, which is quite cool. And this is, for example, the SQL view, but I think you also have the machine learning view, and then you see all different things. So here you can see that I can go to my queries, I can go to my dashboards, and here this was totally different. So here I had access to my workspace and my repositories and things like that. So I think that's quite handy. So with Databricks, if you are working together with people from multiple disciplines, then you can offer them, different user interfaces, and that makes working with Databricks all the nicer. But what's not nice about Databricks? Let's talk a little bit about the downsides. So Azure Databricks offers us a more comprehensive platform. But that also means that setting up Azure Databricks as a tool that requires a little bit more technical knowledge. So you really have to think about, okay, all of the rights within this Azure Databricks workspace, how am I going to distribute it? And how am I going to make sure that everything is secure and that the people that need to see this data can actually see it, but cannot see more data? So it's good to know that if we start up setting an Azure Databricks environment, that we really think about these things, think about the users, think about the rights and who can see what. And that takes some technical knowledge and a little bit more than with Azure Data Factory, I would say. Well, Azure Data Factory offers us this GUI, and that was quite handy for users that don't know how to code. With Azure Databricks, you would at least need to know how to code SQL, but preferably either Python or Scala to really write this Spark code. So it's good to know that if we switch to Azure Databricks, that writing good Apache Spark code, that takes a specific skill set. So that really takes a data engineer or a programmer or a data scientist that really knows about, this processing on Apache Spark. Well, Databricks is not created by Microsoft. So the look and feel of Azure Databricks, in my opinion, so this is a little bit subjective, I would say, it's not like any other Azure tools that are created by Microsoft. So it doesn't have that look and feel. So that could take a little bit of time for people that, that are acquainted with the Azure platform, but not with Databricks. In my experience, connecting data sources is a little bit more intuitive with Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse Analytics, also due to this fact, because in Databricks, connecting data sources is just a little bit different than you're used to. And if you're used to the Azure platform, then using ADF or Azure Synapse Analytics is going to be perhaps a little bit easier for you. But that's in my experience. So if you have a different experience, feel free to share it in the chat, I would say. And there's one thing that you really have to take into account with Databricks. As I mentioned, it's these writes. So I've created a small video to show. So in Azure Databricks, you have writes within the Azure portal to the workspace environment, but within Databricks, you also have writes. And if you don't think about that really thoroughly before you set up a workspace, you can get a situation like this. I will show you. I'm hoping that it starts. Very interesting. Yeah, okay. So as you can see here, that I have the right for user access administrator, which means I don't have rights to the Databricks workspace, but I could potentially distribute rights. So if I launch the workspace, I should get an error. Yeah, it says, okay, you're not owner or contributor, so you cannot access this workspace. Okay, I think I'll just go to the workspace directly then. Oh, and now I'm in. So I can just access the Databricks workspace. Why? I don't have any rights in the portal, but in the Databricks workspace itself, I did have enough rights to see it. And these two types of rights, they don't communicate with one another. So if you have rights in the workspace, but not in the portal, you can just go directly to the workspace and it will give you access just fine. And this is, of course, something we want to avoid at all costs, because we don't want to be in a situation where somebody leaves our team and we forget to revoke the access rights within the workspace, and then have a situation where somebody, you know, maybe many years down the road can still access our workspace. That would not be good. So really take this into account. All right. So that's Azure Databricks, but what about Azure Synapse Analytics? So much like Azure Databricks, Azure Synapse Analytics is quite a comprehensive data analytics platform. We can do ingestion, transformation, analysis, and visualization. And much like with Azure Databricks, we have native Power BI integration, which means that we can just connect Azure Synapse Analytics to our Power BI and utilize it, which is great for a lot of companies that, of course, like to use Power BI, much like Henk, who has a lot of experience with it. In Azure Synapse Analytics, again, multiple disciplines can utilize it. Data engineers can do their data engineering work. Data scientists can create machine learning models and do all their work within Azure Synapse Analytics. And data analysts and BI specialists can query using SQL on the data we have stored there. So that's all great. If we look at the tools that we have within Azure Synapse Analytics, we can query our, well, let's say more unstructured data in the data lake using a Spark pool. So there we can store all kinds of data. If we want to use more structured data, we can store it within our data warehouse and query them using SQL pools. There we can either utilize a serverless SQL pool or a dedicated SQL pool where we have the computational power dedicated to us. Talking about data integration, we can use Synapse pipelines. It's good to know that Synapse pipelines is very, very similar to Azure Data Factory. So you could basically say that within our Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, we have access to Azure Data Factory using these Synapse pipelines. Well, as I mentioned, these Synapse pipelines, much like Azure Data Factory, they run on the integration runtime. Unless you use these data flows, then we have Spark. Well, something that's currently in preview, or maybe it just became general, I'm not 100% sure, but this Data Explorer, there we can explore more log type of data, and we can query these using Data Explorer pools. Well, I told you to mind the languages. So it's a little bit different here compared to Azure Databricks, because here we can utilize Spark with Python, Scala, SQL, and .NET. And what we saw with Databricks, the differences between Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics here is that with Databricks we had R and Java, and here we see that we have .NET. So if you have a lot of people within your company that have experience with .NET, then Azure Synapse Analytics might be the tool for you if you need to make a decision between all of these tools. So it's good to know this. So what would a notebook in Azure Synapse Analytics look like? So here I again implemented the data use case of Henk. I had a cluster called Azure Live, so I only created one cluster here, which is of course a little bit more neat. What you cannot see here is whether the cluster is running or not. So with Azure Databricks, we saw the gray circle, but here I'm a little bit off, just guessing. But what I can see is that the language that I've chosen is Spark, and I'm going to program it in Scala. And Scala is my preferred language. I started off programming Scala, so it's always going to be dear to my heart, of course. But you can also utilize, as I mentioned, something like Python or .NET or even SQL if you wanted to. So that's great. Well, here again, I implemented the use case of Henk using pretty much the same code as with Databricks in the cell. So you can see, well, this is starting to look quite familiar. So it's quite similar to what it would look like in Databricks. So what I did here was I read in the Parquet file from the storage account. I created some additional columns. I grouped them by month, year, and salesperson, which was our use case. Then I aggregated it, changed the column name a bit, then ordered the data and wrote it back to storage. Wow. And then you can see all the different tasks of the cluster that just ran. You can see what went successful and, you know, sometimes what did not go super successful, and we can go and dig through them if we want. But I don't have any slides on that because that would be a little bit technical for this talk, I think. All right. What about the downside of Azure Synapse Analytics? Well, much like Azure Databricks, it's good to know that this requires technical knowledge in order to set it up correctly. We really have to think about who has access to our workspace, who should see what type of data. And now we're in a situation where we don't only have the storage account, but we also have these SQL pools where we have our more structured data, and who can see tables in the SQL pools, or who can maybe utilize Spark but cannot see data in the SQL pools. You really have to think about that for all of the users that you onboard, who can see what, and really ensure that this goes correctly and really stay on top of it. Much as with Databricks, writing good code, that takes a specific skill set, right? A specific mindset. You need to know how to code Spark and Scala, or even Python, or, you know, all of these things. Wow. A downside specifically for Azure Synapse Analytics, and this is quite subjective, so just mind that. Other people might have a different experience, but in my experience, the maturity of Azure Synapse Analytics. And it has also to do, I think, with the fact that Databricks has been around for a little bit longer time. But I don't just want to say, oh yeah, the maturity in Azure Synapse Analytics is a little bit less. I do want to give some examples to really, you know, get the point across. So I have a snippet here of code that I ran for this workshop that I tried. So what you see here is that at first, what I did was I tried to read in all the data. I just aggregated it by sales, and then I tried to write it back. So what Synapse then told me was, hey, this aggregate that created a column name that's called sum of sales using brackets, and that's an invalid character. I thought, okay, well, that's, you know, a little bit odd, because if you think about it, aggregation is a function that is readily available in Spark. So it's out of the box. It's nothing fancy, nothing weird, you know. So this aggregate, that's something Spark often uses. And the output sum of sales between brackets is also pretty standard. And if we look at the Parquet format, Parquet doesn't really limit us to use these kind of brackets. So this is specifically a Azure Synapse Analytics thing, where you are limited to using some of these special characters. So if I were to run this in Databricks, nothing would happen. It would just write it to storage and everything would be fine. But in Azure Synapse Analytics, mainly I would say due to the maturity of this tool, this doesn't work. But we have more edge cases. For example, people that are very acquainted with using virtual machines in subscriptions, there is a limit in a subscription on the amount of virtual machines that you can use. So in the first snippet, you have something in Azure Databricks where I was in a situation, because we use a shared subscription with our company, that I was trying to create a cluster. And of course, these clusters, they utilize virtual machines under the hood to provide computational power. And I was trying to make a cluster between 2 and 8 workers, and Databricks then gives me the notification saying, hey, you're trying to create this cluster, but if I look at the things that are available in your subscription, you might not have enough CPU cores to satisfy your requests. And this is the amount that we have available, and this is the amount that you requested. So what you could do is you could try to start this cluster, but we're not too sure about it. Probably it will not succeed in creating this cluster. Well, then at the beginning, you kind of know the situation you're in and what you need to do. Then with Azure Synapse Analytics, we're in a totally different scenario. So we can just create a cluster and it won't give us any notifications. And then it will say, oh, hey, you requested 20 vCores, however, the pool has a 12 core limit, and that just happens after you've waited like 5 minutes for it to start. And I think maturity-wise, that's quite a difference. The Databricks says it immediately from the get-go, and with Synapse, you have to wait for like 5 minutes before you get the error. All right. So let's start comparing tools. If we talk about Azure Data Factory, what we use in Azure Data Factory is a graphical user interface. It's very nice for users that don't know how to code. With Azure Data Factory, we can take care of data ingestion and data transformation use cases. What we cannot is we cannot utilize data science use cases, do data analysis, and do data storage. What we can do in this data flows is utilize Spark, but we cannot program it ourselves. If we talk about Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, you can see that we can write the Spark code. With Azure Synapse Analytics, we can also use a GUI, but that is with this Synapse pipelines, which, as I mentioned, is mainly a one-to-one copy of Azure Data Factory, but then with a little bit less functionality. And if we look at use cases we can do data ingestion, data transformation, data science, data analysis, data visualization, and we can even store data in these environments if we wanted to. So these are both quite comprehensive tools. Meanwhile, Azure Data Factory is mainly geared towards ingestion and transformation. So what do you think Henk should choose based on this information? Let me refresh it to have it go up. Yes. A lot of people right from the start are saying Synapse Analytics. That's good. I mean, I think Synapse Analytics could definitely take care of this use case, right? Because we have a use case where we want to do data ingestion, we want to do some transformations. So if we want to do it in Spark or in the Synapse pipelines, that could be both a good option. I think Azure Data Factory could work as well, and Databricks, even though not as popular today, could take care of the job. Yeah, good. Some more Azure Synapse Analytics coming in. All right. Well, it's a popular tool, so I totally get that. All right. So Henk is starting to think, if from a theoretical perspective, I could use all of these 3 tools because he just has a use case for ingestion and transformation, and then he wants to do the visualizations in Power BI, then okay, I could use all of these 3 tools, but how would I then make a decision, right? If I could do it with all of these 3 tools, how do I know what tool is best for me? Well, first of all, Henk is Dutch, so he's kind of a cheapskate. He thinks, okay, let's compare it by cost. But is that really so easy? If we take a step back, as I mentioned, with Azure Data Factory, we can utilize the integration runtime using these pipelines and activities. But with Azure Databricks, we would immediately use Spark, which is based on clusters. And with Synapse Analytics, we could maybe utilize these dedicated pools. So is it really that easy to just compare costs without running it first, which of course would be quite cumbersome? Well, It's good to know that now we're going to compare costs. As I said, there are differences for pipelines, for all of these different tools. So it's extremely difficult to compare. But it's also difficult to compare for other reasons. So if we would just look at Spark, which is used with all of these three tools, Synapse uses Spark in the Spark pools, and then we have Databricks clusters, and then we can utilize Spark in the data flows for Azure Data Factory. Then what we see is they don't use the same setup when it comes to these clusters, which makes it extremely difficult to compare. But even if they were to use the same clusters, then tools are differently optimized under the hood. And that basically means that the Spark they use is not the same Spark as you would download from the Apache Spark website. They try to optimize it, and all of these tools do that differently. So you would have to run all of these flows before you would know 100% certain what tool is going to be more expensive, because they don't finish at the same time. Well, I did try to make small comparisons. So what you can see here is I created 3 clusters that are quite similar, but as I said, not 100% equal, because that's just not feasible to create 100% equal clusters. But what you can see here mainly is that Azure Databricks and Synapse Analytics, they are quite similar when it comes to cost. And then meanwhile, Azure Data Factory is a little bit more expensive per hour for this cluster type. And that's something that we see in practice very often as well. So Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, it's a little bit debatable how costly they are, but then usually when customers move from data flows to utilizing, Spark, but then programming Spark in Synapse Analytics or Azure Databricks, then usually they pay less than you would with the data flow. So that's good to keep in mind from the get-go here, that if you want to utilize Azure Data Factory and you want to create these data flows, then they're not cheap. They're not cheap. All right, so Hank thinks, okay, if it's so difficult for me to compare these costs and I don't want to use those data flows, I just want to use the activities, then, well, if I cannot make a decision on costs, then I just want the tool that performs best, because, the process that finished the fastest means I don't have to wait so long. So, okay. What data use case were we trying to solve again? Just a quick reminder, we were loading sales data, aggregating sales data per salesperson per month, and we had over 6 million records. So Hank just thinks, okay, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create a benchmark. Oh, these were the costs I just mentioned. So what Hank did is he created his use case. He deployed Azure Synapse Analytics, Azure Databricks, and Azure Data Factory. He just ran this processing, this flow for a few times, and then we could see what tool finished fastest. Well, what you can see here is that Azure Data Factory doesn't cache, so that means that for all of these runs, they finish for about the same time. So, but Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, they do cache these results. So the second and the third run is going to be a lot more fast. Well, what you see here is that, which was quite surprising for me as well, that Azure Synapse Analytics for the first run was the slowest tool. And then Azure Databricks throughout all of these runs was the fastest. And then Azure Data Factory is just, very flat, because, it doesn't cache the results. Well, if we translate that back to costs, then you see that in this case, Azure Synapse Analytics for the first run was the most expensive tool. And then Azure Databricks becomes progressively cheaper, but throughout runs is actually the cheapest tool. Well, that's great, you could say. Okay, so Databricks is the least expensive tool, most cost effective, and it also finished fastest. Well, let's just go with Databricks, right? But would we then really make the right decision? Because usually when we choose a tool, there's going to be many data projects, right? And how do we know that they are going to finish equally fast? Well, the answer is we don't. And even, if we have this benchmark for this specific Spark thing, then other techniques might differ as well. So if we have Synapse SQL or Databricks SQL and we create a query there, will they, will the performance difference be the same? No. If you want to store data using a Parquet Delta format instead of Parquet, then are they going to finish equally fast? No. So these things we don't know from the get-go, and it's extremely difficult to really see all of these performance differences when we start off a project. And even if we were to say, okay, we're going to think about all of these different things, and we're going to make a decision and really make a comprehensive decision and really think about it, then it's also a moving target. So all of these performance differences that we see today are going to be, from a few months from now, they're going to come out with new things, and then everything is going to be different. So that's why I usually say that execution costs and performance, they are rarely a good decision maker, because all of these different tools, they use different techniques, and you have all of these different use cases. It's just not feasible to make a decision based on these things. However, if you are so inclined to do so, to make a decision on costs and performance, then it's good to know what I mentioned already. Data flows do not come in cheap. And at this moment, so if you see this talk back maybe a few months from now, it might not be the same. But at this moment, the general consensus is that Azure Databricks, as we saw with our benchmark, performs best, or at least equally good to Synapse Analytics. All right. So that's good to know. That's good to know. But that doesn't really give us an answer, did it? Because we tried to compare it on performance and on costs, and it really wasn't a good decision maker. So what can we decide on? Well, Henk thought, okay, I want a tool that's suitable for my use case. And then he found out that all of the free tools could work perfectly fine. He had an ingestion and transformation use case, and we can do it with all of these tools. Well, then Henk was Dutch, so he thought, okay, just give me the cheapest one to run. And then he kind of found out that, maybe for this use case, we could find the cheapest one to run, but in reality, that's just not feasible. We cannot test all of these scenarios and then find out which one is the cheapest. Well, then just give me the best performing one, he thought. Oh yeah, but due to all these differences in tools and how they utilize Apache Spark and all of these different things we can choose, the best performing one is quite a difficult decision to make. And how do we know that in the future, the tool that we choose now is going to be the best performing one in a year from now? The answer is we don't. So that's also not a good decision maker, usually. So what are we left off with? Well, I would say the decision for Azure Data Factory, that's the easiest one. So if you don't know how to code and you're not willing to learn to code, or you don't have the time, or you don't have the wish, then usually Azure Data Factory is going to be the tool for you. But if you choose it, it's good to know that it's just for data ingestion and data transformation use cases. So if you want to do data science, if you want to do data visualization, then you have to move on to either Databricks or Azure Synapse Analytics. From a technology perspective, we can do same types of use cases with Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, and that's also why this decision is so extremely complicated. In my experience, usually the decision between Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics is a maturity versus integration question. So in my experience, Azure Databricks, as I've show you, the Databricks platform offers us more maturity. So it's just a little bit easier to work with if you are acquainted with Databricks. It goes a little bit more smooth. But Azure Synapse Analytics, on the other hand, integrates very well within Azure, making it a little bit easier to onboard data sources. And that, of course, has to do with the fact that Synapse Analytics is created by Microsoft. Well, if you are having a team that has a lot of different knowledge and know-how, then it's good to know that in Synapse Analytics, we have the graphical user interface and code integrated with one another. So that could also be a benefit. And it has a familiar look and feel for users that are acquainted with the platform, making the adoption of it a little bit easier for users that are acquainted with, for example, Azure SQL Server. So I want to ask you for the last time, what do you think Henk should choose? Let me see if it buffers. Yes, no, it did not. Sorry about that. I'll refresh it because it's still pending for me, the other slides. Yeah. All right. I think it's interesting because before everyone was like, yeah, Synapse Analytics. And now people are like, yeah, maybe that maturity is a big thing. I would say if Hank really wants to have a mature platform, then Azure Databricks is a very good option for him to choose. Yeah. And then a lot less people are now choosing Azure Data Factory, which I think makes sense. But if you want to code and if you don't want to pay too much using the data flows, then yeah. All right, so let's continue with the conclusion, because that was not easy, right? So Azure Data Factory, that comes in handy for users that don't know how to code. But Hank knew how to code, right? If we choose Azure Data Factory, it's good to know that it's not suitable for users that want to solve data science, data analysis, or data visualization use cases. So if you want to have these use cases solved, this is not the tool for you. It offers us less flexibility than if we were to code. Well, that has to do with the nature of the GUI, of course. And if we want to utilize Apache Spark, we can using data flows, but usually they come at a cost. How much the cost difference this is, that differs from use case to use case, but generically speaking, it comes at a cost. Well, Azure Databricks offered us a comprehensive and mature and user-friendly platform where we could solve these data science, data analysis, or data visualization use cases. Setting it up, that does require some technical knowledge, as we saw in the video. If we don't take care of the rights in a good way from the get-go, then we're going to have issues in the end. With Azure Synapse Analytics, we also need to think about similar things. So really think about it when you set up Synapse Analytics. Who can see your data, and more importantly, who should not? It offers us a well-integrated platform on Azure, meaning that onboarding data sources might be a little bit easier for you than doing it with Databricks. But of course, that's a subjective opinion. And it offers you a look and feel that you might be familiar with if you are familiar with Microsoft or the Azure platform like Azure SQL Server, for example. And this is exactly the reason as to why I would offer Hank to use Azure Synapse Analytics, because Hank had some experience with coding. He could do Python, he could do SQL, but he was also acquainted with the SQL Server and writing SQL code. And that means that for Hank, if he started onboarding his use case using Azure Synapse Analytics, then Azure Synapse Analytics would offer him a look and feel that he would be familiar with, meaning that the adoption would be a little bit more smooth for him. If Hank didn't have this experience, I would have probably offered him to use Azure Databricks because of this mature and user-friendly platform. But for now, for Hank, my conclusion would be to use Azure Synapse Analytics. Well, I always like, if you want to look at decision charts later on, then it's good to pause the video here. I always like it because it offers, some decisions and it looks nice. So if you know how to code and you are acquainted with the Azure platform, then you have the decision. Do you care about a mature platform or a well-integrated one on Azure? If you care about integration, choose Azure Synapse Analytics. If you care about maturity, use Azure Databricks. If you are not acquainted with the Azure platform, I would say always go for the mature platform, and then you land with Azure Databricks from the get-go. If you don't know how to code and you don't have any wish to learn how to code, then Azure Data Factory is probably going to be the best tool for you. But before you start off, make sure that your data sources are natively integrated with Azure Data Factory, because if they are not, you're going to have a bad time on Azure Data Factory, and you might still be better off learning to code altogether. And that was it for me today. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, my name is Lisa Hoving. If you have any further questions after this chat, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn and just send me a message and I'll be there. But for now, I'm only left off to say thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, I would answer them now.
Thanks a million, Lisa. That was great. There's a couple of questions in here to get us started. If anybody else has questions, go ahead and type them into the questions window now. So the first one that's come in is, where would the use case for Azure analysis services sit alongside Data Factory, Databricks, or Synapse? Are any of them mutually exclusive?
Sorry, could you repeat that because you were breaking up for me for a second?
Oh, sorry, just a moment there. Let me just make it a bit bigger here. Where would the use case for Azure analysis services sit alongside Data Factory, Databricks, or Synapse? Are any of them mutually exclusive?
That's a good question. I would say if you want to use SSIS, then you can utilize it with Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse Analytics. So these are both options, I would say, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Can I gather data from CSV files which are stored in zip files on an SFTP server, or should I prepare the file somewhere else first?
So that's a good question. I think an SFTP server, I'm not sure if this is natively integrated with ADF, with Azure Data Factory, so that you would have to look up. If not, I think there are plenty of options to go from an SFTP server to an Azure storage account, which would make your use case a little bit easier because Azure Synapse Analytics, Azure Databricks, and Azure Data Factory, they all work extremely well with these storage accounts. And then if you want to keep it on the SFTP server and you want to utilize Databricks or Synapse Analytics, if you can connect using Python, then you can also, or Scala, then you can connect using Spark. So that would also be an option for you, I would say. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. But then you would have to look at, if you use Spark, at the packages that are readily available. But if they are, then you know that could be an option for you. And if that's not an option, I would say look at the connection between the SFTP server and the storage account, because there are plenty of options there. So then first get it into the storage account and then start utilizing your use case. And then that it's zipped, that's another thing to talk about. So for Azure Data Factory, that your file is zipped is not an issue. But with Spark, if you want to do it in Spark, that's a little bit more cumbersome. So take care of that, but it is an option to do it using Spark. But if you want to unzip your data, then it might also be a pragmatic way to maybe utilize a logic app to unzip it. So yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. What storage options would you recommend to use with Synapse or Databricks?
I would say storage accounts, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 more specifically, they are perfectly suitable to utilize with Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics. When it comes to Azure Synapse Analytics, you have Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 automatically deployed with your workspace, so you don't have to do any additional work. And then with Azure Databricks, it is not, so you would have to separately deploy this ADLS Gen 2. And then you can connect to it using OAuth. And for Synapse Analytics, that's already taken care of. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Is it possible to use a combination of Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks, and/or Azure Synapse Analytics? If so, what use cases would you advise this for?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So what we often do for customers is when they are not that acquainted with coding, but they might be willing to learn in the future, then we deploy Azure Data Factory together with Azure Databricks. And that's a very nice hybrid solution, because what you can do in Azure Data Factory is you have these activities where you can kick off notebooks from Azure Databricks. So then they can start off using the GUI in Azure Data Factory and create some pipelines there. But if they want to create more generic pipelines, or they have more complicated data transformation use cases, then you can create some Spark code, put it in Databricks, and then kick it off using Azure Data Factory. So that's the thing that we would often recommend to customers that are starting in the realm of data and they're a little bit unsure what they want to choose, and then utilizing these two tools together could make a perfect hybrid solution.
Okay, and lots of questions coming in, Lisa. We've got time for a few more. SharePoint go or no go? Question mark. I'm not sure.
I mean, always a go. I don't know. It's a good question. Maybe with relation to whether that works well with these tools. I don't know by heart if these are natively integrated. I don't think so, but I would have to look that up. So if you want to discuss it further, SharePoint question mark, feel free to reach out via LinkedIn, I would say.
Okay, we'll do one or two more. How to load local data to feed to them? Are they all seamlessly sourced? Are they all seamlessly sourced data from Data Lake? What are the recommendations?
Going from local to Azure to the data lake storage, I would say that depends where your data is stored locally. You know, so customers do this in many different ways. So sometimes they just have a program running that puts it into the cloud. But usually what I find is that customers, if they have their data stored locally, that it's coming from some kind of source system anyways, and they just stored it locally for some reason to utilize it there, because usually data isn't created locally, right? So I would say, okay, if this happens, I would usually look at where the data is created and then connect to the source system. Because in my experience, if you want to create a generic pipeline that runs automatically, the data is not created locally. So just look at the source system first, I would say.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We're running out of time now. We'll do one more question. There's a few more in, but as you said, you've kindly offered to let people ask you questions on LinkedIn as well. So
yeah.
What is the killer feature of Synapse that Databricks can't do?
That's a very good question. I think it's maybe, yeah, for some specific use cases, you could say that, you know, one tool could be better than the other tool. But I think when it comes to functionality, for most companies, they are extremely similar, if not the same, functionality-wise, these two tools. So I don't think there's one killer thing. Yeah, for me, as I mentioned, it's basically the maturity thing that is for me a killer to use Synapse. And sometimes we get into these edge cases when, you know, we just have errors within the Synapse Analytics workspace that are extremely difficult to explain. And with Azure Databricks, I have this way less than with Synapse Analytics. But then again, Synapse Analytics is an extremely comprehensive platform, and we have Synapse pipelines integrated within it as well. So we can use it with users that don't know how to code. And this is something we don't have within Databricks. So yeah, so I don't think there's one killer thing that would say, oh, use this or use that. But for me, it's mainly the maturity. Yeah.
That's fantastic, Lisa. Thanks so much. Well, look, this is the end of the webinar then. On behalf of the ESPC community, thank you so much. It was a great webinar.
Well, thank you. It was great being here. And if there are people that have any further questions, feel free to reach out, I would say.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. That's the end of it for today. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.